A man reached the top of North America alone, in the dead of winter, and then simply vanished on the way down. His body is still up there. Naomi Uemura climbed Denali in February 1984 and radioed that he'd made the summit. Then, the mountain took him. Most people can't even find Denali on a map, and it stands nearly 9,000 feet shorter than Everest. So here's the thing that makes no sense. This lower mountain punishes climbers as if it were far higher. Everyone says it's the cold. The cold is only the very beginning of the answer. Start with where it actually is, because that location is doing more damage than most people realize. Denali sits in the interior of Alaska, deep in the Alaska Range, at 63 degrees north latitude, only a couple hundred miles south of the Arctic Circle. Hold on to that number, 63, because it becomes the whole story later. The summit stands at 20,310 feet, remeasured by satellite in 2015 after a century of being called Mount McKinley. That makes it the highest point on the continent, but height above sea level is the least interesting number here. What matters is how far the mountain rises from the ground directly beneath it. Everest starts from a Tibetan plateau that already sits around 17,000 feet, so the pyramid you actually climb is roughly 12,000 feet of relief. Denali erupts out of lowland barely 2,000 feet above the sea. From base to summit, it lifts something close to 18,000 feet in one continuous wall of rock, snow, and ice. By that measure, the rise of the land, Denali, is one of the largest mountains on the planet. It is bigger, in the way your body experiences it, than the mountain everyone considers the ultimate prize. Now shrink the map down to one person. Almost every climber begins the same way, in a small town called Talkeetna, about 100 miles to the south. They load into a ski-equipped bush plane operated by one of a handful of air taxis, and in roughly 45 minutes they lift off from an airstrip at 358 feet and land on the Kahiltna Glacier at 7,200 feet. Think about that jump. In less than an hour, a person goes from Alaskan spruce forest to standing on a river of ice, nearly 1.5 miles higher, surrounded by walls that vanish into cloud. There is no road out. There is no walking back to town through that terrain. The plane is the door, and the door only opens when the weather lets it. That single fact quietly shapes everything that follows, because the way in is also the only way out. From that glacier, the standard route stretches upward for miles. And here is the first surprise. There are no porters on Denali. There is no army of high-altitude workers carrying loads and fixing ropes across the dangerous sections the way there is on Everest. On Denali, you carry your own life on your back and drag the rest behind you on a plastic sled. Climbers haul enormous loads, ferrying supplies up the mountain in stages, caching food and fuel, descending, resting, climbing again. A typical expedition spends 2 to 3 weeks living on the mountain. That length of exposure is not a detail. It means that instead of a fast strike at the summit during one good weather window, you are betting that a subarctic mountain will give you 2 or 3 uninterrupted weeks without trying to kill you. It almost never does. So people freeze. That's the easy answer, and it isn't wrong exactly. Winter temperatures on the upper mountain drop to 40 below zero and colder. And when you add the wind, the number your skin actually feels can fall past 70 or 80 below. But cold is only the trigger. The real trap is something you cannot see, cannot feel building, and cannot argue with. And it comes straight out of that latitude number I told you to hold. Here is the mechanism. The atmosphere is not the same thickness everywhere on Earth. Near the equator, the layer of air above you bulges outward, held high by heat, and there is a huge mass of cold, dense air stacked in the stratosphere over the tropics. That weight presses down and keeps the air pressure relatively high, even at extreme elevation. Near the poles, the atmosphere is thinner and it sags closer to the ground. Denali, at 63 degrees north, sits under that thinner, sagging polar sky. The result is brutal, and almost nobody expects it. The barometric pressure at Denali's summit is significantly lower than the pressure you'd find at the same elevation near the equator. Your lungs don't measure feet. They measure pressure. They measure how many oxygen molecules you pull in with each breath. And by that measure, the air on top of Denali behaves like the air 2,000 to 2,300 feet higher on a tropical peak. Physiologists studying this have found that in early May, the pressure at Denali's 20,000-foot summit can match the pressure found near 22,600 feet on Everest. The map says 20,300. Your body thinks it's standing far higher. The mountain lies about its own height, and it tells that lie in the one currency that keeps you alive. Translate that into what a person feels. A climber who trained for a 20,000-foot peak arrives on a mountain that, to their blood and brain, is closer to 23,000. Thinking slows, judgment frays. Simple tasks, clipping a carabiner, melting snow for water, deciding whether to turn around, take longer, and go wrong more often. And this thinner air doesn't only starve people, it starves engines too, which becomes its own problem when a rescue depends on a helicopter that also has to breathe. This is why climbing Denali is a slow, grinding negotiation with your own blood, and why those 2 to 3 weeks on the mountain aren't leisure, they're medicine. The body can adapt to thin air, but only slowly, by making more red blood cells and rewiring how it uses oxygen. And if you climb faster than that adaptation, the altitude starts to kill you from the inside. So climbers move up the west buttress in deliberate stages, camping at 11,000 feet, then 14,200, then a brutal high camp at 17,200. And between them, they practice what mountaineers call climb high, sleep low, carrying a load up to the next camp and then descending to sleep, forcing their bodies to acclimatize, rush it. And you invite the two conditions that stalk every high mountain. High-altitude pulmonary edema floods the lungs with fluid until each breath is like drowning on dry land. High-altitude cerebral edema swells the brain, and it announces itself with confusion, stumbling, and terrible judgment, which is exactly the cruelty of it, because the organ you'd use to recognize the emergency is the organ being poisoned. On a mountain that already behaves 3,000 feet taller than the map says, climbing too fast punishes you sooner than almost anywhere on Earth. The people who lived in this land understood the mountain long before any of this was measured. The Koyukon Athabascan people named it Denali, the High One, or the Tall One, and that name carried across generations until it finally became the mountain's official name again in 2015. They didn't climb it. That restraint mattered. Knowing when not to go, reading a sky that turns without warning, treating the peak as something to live beneath rather than conquer, is a form of knowledge, not superstition. The climbing came later, and it came from outside. The first confirmed ascent was in 1913 when Hudson Stuck, Harry Karstens, Walter Harper, and Robert Tatum fought their way to the top, with Harper the first human to actually set foot on the summit. For decades after, Denali stayed the province of hardened expeditions. Then, in 1951, a mountaineer and mapmaker named Bradford Washburn pioneered a new line up the mountain called the West Buttress. Washburn had photographed and surveyed Denali obsessively, and he found a route that was less technical, less exposed, and more logical than anything tried before. It became known as the safest and easiest way up the highest mountain in North America. That reputation changed everything. Today, around 11 to 1,200 people attempt Denali every year, and roughly 90% of them start up that same West Buttress. It is the beginner's version of a giant, the mountain you climb before you dream about the Himalaya. And here is where the reassurance turns cold. If the West Buttress is the safe, easy route, it should be where people are least likely to die. It's the opposite. When researchers studied Denali's fatalities across the 20th century, roughly half of all deaths on the entire mountain had occurred on that one, supposedly gentle route. Not because the path itself is uniquely treacherous, but because that's where the people are. The easiest door in is the one the most unprepared people walk through, and the mountain does not grade on a curve. The overall death rate runs around 3 deaths for every 1,000 summit attempts, and something close to half of all fatalities come from a single cause: falls, people sliding on hard. Wind-scoured slopes, where a slip that would be nothing on a hiking trail becomes a 1,000-foot ride into a crevasse. The number that's supposed to comfort you, easiest route, is exactly the number that should scare you. So altitude is quietly higher than advertised, and the route funnels crowds of relatively inexperienced climbers onto slopes that punish small mistakes. Now add the sky. This is where the mountain stops being difficult and becomes lethal, because Denali generates some of the most violent, fastest-changing mountain weather on Earth. And it does it because of where it stands. At 63 degrees north, Denali sits directly in the path of the polar jet stream, and the storm tracks it drags along. Huge weather systems spin off the Bering Sea to the west and roll up warm and wet from the Gulf of Alaska to the south. And when they slam into the wall of the Alaska Range, they are forced upward, wrung out, and turned into wind and snow with almost no warning. Park rangers tell visitors to expect sun, wind, rain, and cloud, and to expect all of them on the same day. On the upper mountain, that variability is not an inconvenience. A clear morning can become a whiteout by afternoon, with winds strong enough to knock a standing person flat and cold, deep enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. And the storms don't pass in an hour. They can sit on the mountain for days, pinning climbers in snow caves and tents, while their food and fuel run down and the temperature keeps dropping. Forecasting has improved enormously, but a forecast only tells you the storm is coming. It cannot move you off the mountain. On Denali, high up, there is nowhere fast to go. The raw numbers this mountain can produce are almost hard to believe. In June 2002, researchers installed an automatic weather station at the 19,000-foot level, one of the highest weather stations on the planet. What it recorded silenced any argument about how extreme this place gets. On the 1st of December 2003, it logged a temperature of about 75.5 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The day before, a reading of roughly 74 below combined with the wind to produce a wind chill near 118 degrees below 0, a North American record. Scientists who studied the station's data called Denali's high slopes one of the coldest and most savage spots on Earth. And they weren't being dramatic. At those temperatures, exposed flesh doesn't slowly get cold. It freezes hard, in the time it takes to fix a jammed zipper with a bare hand. Frostbite on Denali isn't a risk to manage later. It's a countdown that starts the moment a glove comes off. In July of 1967, a young graduate student named Joe Wilcox led a 12-man expedition up the West Buttress in the middle of the climbing season, when conditions are supposed to be at their most forgiving. His group had merged with 3 experienced climbers from Colorado, and by any reasonable standard, this was a strong, well-supplied team attempting the mountain at the right time of year. Continuing looked completely reasonable. The weather had been workable, the route was the standard one, and 11 of the 12 would ultimately reach the summit across 2 separate pushes. The first group went up, tagged the top, and came back down. Then a second group of 7 pushed for the summit from the high camp near 18,000 feet. That's when the sky closed. A storm rolled in that veterans would later describe as one of the worst ever recorded on the mountain. A system so severe that weather models reconstructing it afterward suggested sustained winds and gusts far beyond anything a tent or a human body can withstand, well over 100 miles an hour, with temperatures ranging from 15 to 30 below before the wind was even counted. The 7 climbers high on the mountain were caught above the point where a fast retreat was possible. The safe move is always to descend below the worst of the wind, but descending means moving. And moving in that storm meant being blown off your feet on exposed, icy ground with zero visibility. The option to go down had effectively been taken away. They dug in and tried to wait it out, which was the only thing left to do, and the storm simply did not stop. It hammered the upper mountain for days. Down below, the climbers who had already descended could do nothing but listen and wait, unable to climb back up into the same wall of wind that was killing their teammates. When it finally broke, 7 men were gone. Jerry Clark, John Russell, Dennis Luchterhand, Hank Janes, Walt Taylor, Steve Taylor, and Mark McLaughlin. It remains the deadliest disaster in Denali's history. And here is the detail that should stay with you. Only 3 of the 7 bodies were ever found. The mountain kept the rest. That is the answer to a question you might not have thought to ask yet: why bodies stay up there. Denali is so cold, so remote, so buried in moving snow and ice, and so often unreachable by any aircraft, that when it takes someone high on the peak, recovering them can be impossible. They become part of the mountain. What the Wilcox disaster proved was uncomfortable. This was not a reckless team. This was not the wrong season. This was a strong group, in peak summer, on the standard route, doing everything by the book. And it did not matter, because when that subarctic storm system detonated over the summit, skill and preparation and good timing all became irrelevant at once. But 5 of them survived. And that fact plants a dangerous idea. The same idea that keeps pulling people back to this mountain. Maybe the ones who died were simply caught in the wrong place. Maybe someone good enough, someone climbing smart, someone who truly understood the mountain, could beat it. Maybe the answer was to strip the expedition down to a single expert who trusted no one's judgment but his own. Which brings us back to the man from the opening. Naomi Uemura was not an ordinary climber. He was one of the most accomplished adventurers alive, a Japanese explorer who had already soloed to the North Pole by dog sled, rafted the Amazon, and climbed the highest peak on multiple continents. In the winter of 1984, he came to Denali to do something no one had ever done, to climb it solo, alone, in the dead of the Alaskan winter, when the cold and the darkness and the storms are at their absolute worst. He knew this mountain. He had climbed it before, in 1970 by the West Buttress, and it was that same familiar route he chose again. He flew onto the Kahiltna in late January and started up from base camp on the 1st of February. On February 12th, his 43rd birthday, Naomi Uemura reached the summit of Denali. He became the first person ever to stand on top of that mountain alone in winter. The next day, February 13th, he made radio contact with a team of Japanese photographers and reported that he had summited and descended back down to around 18,000 feet. He said he expected to reach base camp in about 2 more days. He sounded like a man who had already done the hard part. Then the mountain went quiet. The radio never crackled again. Weather closed over the upper slopes, and Uemura, somewhere on that descent, disappeared. A search was launched as soon as conditions allowed, and searchers found traces of him, a snow cave he had dug and used, his diary, and his camera left inside. The diary reportedly ended with words about climbing McKinley no matter what. But of the man himself, there was nothing. More than 40 years later, his body has never been recovered. Like the Wilcox climbers, he became part of the mountain. Notice exactly where it happened. not on the way up, on the way down. Uemura had already achieved the thing he came for. He had solved the summit, the goal that consumes every climber's attention, and it was the descent, the part everyone treats as the reward at the end, that killed him. This is the reversal the mountain keeps teaching and people keep refusing to learn. Reaching the top is not the finish line. It's the halfway point, made at the moment you are most tired, most oxygen-starved, most likely to make the small error that a thin, freezing, unforgiving atmosphere turns into a fatal one. Uemura was arguably the most experienced solo adventurer on the planet, and his experience did not save him, because the trap on Denali is not solved by being good. The isolation that made his climb legendary was the same isolation that meant when something went wrong at 18,000 feet in winter, there was no partner to hold a rope, no second brain to check his judgment, and no possible rescue in time. Uemura's death wasn't a freak exception to the rule. It was the rule, written large. The numbers on Denali point relentlessly in one direction. One review of accidents on the mountain found that around 61% of them happened during the descent, not the climb, because that's when climbers are emptied out, hypoxic, dehydrated, and moving downhill on legs that no longer trust the ground. There is one stretch of the standard route that proves it better than any statistic: the traverse between the 17,200-foot high camp and Denali Pass at around 18,200 feet. It's a rising slope of hard, wind-polished snow, and coming down it, exhausted, at the end of a summit day, is one of the most dangerous things a climber does on the entire mountain. Since 1980, at least 14 people have died in falls on that single traverse, not on some sheer technical wall. On the tired walk home from the top, on ground a fresh climber would stroll across without a second thought. That is the shape of the trap. It waits for the moment you believe the hard part is behind you. So the lone expert isn't safe. Then surely the answer is the opposite: a team, roped together, guided by a professional who knows every foot of the route. That has to be the safe version. Follow that logic straight into the spring of 1992, the deadliest climbing season in Denali's history. 11 people died on the mountain that year, and in a single stretch, 7 of them died in 7 days. One of those 7 was a man named Muggs Stump, and his death is the one that dismantles the last comforting assumption. Muggs Stump was not a beginner who wandered onto the mountain. He was one of the finest alpinists America had ever produced, a climber of legendary boldness and skill. And on Denali, he was working as a professional guide, leading 2 clients down the south buttress after their climb. This was the descent, the supposedly easier direction, on relatively moderate ground, led by an expert who had climbed some of the hardest routes in the world. On the 21st of May, at around 14,400 feet, Stump moved to the front of the 3-man rope team to cross a snow-covered section. The danger there is invisible by design. Glaciers are riddled with crevasses, deep splits in the ice, and over the winter they get bridged with snow that looks exactly like solid ground until the instant it isn't. Stump stepped onto one of those hidden bridges, and it collapsed under him. He dropped into the crevasse, and the ice and snow came down on top of him. His 2 clients survived. His body was never recovered. Sit with what that incident proves, because it's the piece most people miss. Stump wasn't killed by the altitude that fooled the beginners, or the storm that overwhelmed the Wilcox team, or the winter isolation that swallowed Uemura. He was killed by ordinary glacier travel, on the descent, on moderate terrain, doing something he'd done thousands of times, and being one of the best in the world bought him nothing. The mountain doesn't only strike at the summit or during the great storms. It kills quietly, low down, on the routine parts of the route, in the direction everyone treats as going home. The everyday glacier is as dangerous as the peak. And once you understand that, one question is left standing: the one that modern climbers stake their lives on. If altitude, weather, isolation, and hidden ice can all kill even the experts, hasn't modern technology finally closed the gap? Isn't there now a rescue? There is. And it is genuinely extraordinary. The National Park Service runs one of the most advanced high-altitude rescue operations anywhere on Earth, directly on Denali. During the climbing season, rangers staff a medical camp at 14,200 feet, high in West Buttress, ready to respond to emergencies. And when someone is stranded or injured up high, the Park Service can call on a specialized helicopter, historically the Aerospatiale Llama, a machine specifically capable of flying and landing at altitudes that would stall an ordinary rescue helicopter. These aircraft have performed some of the highest helicopter rescues ever accomplished in North America. In one operation, a llama reached climbers in serious trouble on the Cassin Ridge, near 17,700 feet, landing on a tiny patch of ice around 15,000 feet to pull them off the mountain, then ferrying them down to the 14,000-foot camp and on to base. Read that back. A helicopter, landing above 15,000 feet, plucking people off one of the most serious ridges on the continent. This is the modern promise made real, the idea that no matter how bad it gets, someone can come for you. That camp is the beating heart of the whole promise, and it runs on people, not just aircraft. Volunteer patrol members and mountaineering rangers, many of them accomplished climbers themselves, live up there for weeks at a time, working a small medical tent in one of the harshest inhabited spots in North America. They treat frostbite and altitude sickness on site. They can start warming and stabilizing a failing climber, and they can sometimes short-haul a patient using the helicopter, suspended beneath it on a line, when landing isn't possible. But even that heart has a physical ceiling, and it's the same thin air that started this whole story. A helicopter generates lift by pushing against the air, and up high, there's less air to push. The higher and colder it gets, the less the machine can carry, and the closer it flies to the edge of what's aerodynamically possible. That's why a rescue near 17 or 18,000 feet is at the absolute limit of the technology, and why a climber who collapses above the high camp may be only a couple thousand feet from the rangers and still effectively out of reach. The mountain that thins the air in a climber's lungs thins it under the rescuer's rotor blades at the very same time. Then you learn the limit, and it lands like a door slamming. A rescue on Denali is not a helicopter magically appearing beside a dying climber. It's a chain and every link can break. Someone first has to get a distress signal out, which depends on a radio or a satellite device working in extreme cold. Rangers have to receive it, understand the situation, and decide a flight is even possible. The aircraft and crew have to be ready, and then, before any of it matters, the weather has to allow the machine to fly. That last link is the one the mountain controls. The exact same storm systems that create the emergency, the ones that pin climbers down and freeze them and blow them off their feet, are the storms that ground the helicopter. In one severe episode, winds hit around 110 miles an hour at 14,000 feet, and roughly 60 inches of snow fell at the 7,000-foot base camp in a single 24-hour period. And the rescue helicopter, caught in violent downdrafts, was forced to turn back and land at base, unable to climb into the storm at all. Think about what that means for the people up high. Their signal gets through. Rangers know exactly where they are and exactly what's wrong. The aircraft exists, the crew is willing, the camp is staffed, and none of it can reach them, because the sky between the rescuers and the dying is physically closed. A distress call answered by a machine that cannot leave the ground is its own particular kind of horror. And on Denali, it is not rare. It is the rule whenever the mountain is at its worst, which is precisely when people need rescue most. That is also why the weigh-in matters so much. Remember the plane, the only door. When storms shut down flying, They don't just ground rescues, they ground the air taxis that bring supplies and carry exhausted climbers home. People get stranded on the glacier for days, waiting for a break in the weather, burning food and fuel they'd budgeted for climbing, while the mountain decides when they're allowed to leave. The remoteness that makes Denali feel like a wilderness adventure is the same remoteness that turns a broken ankle, a case of frostbite, or a bad night of altitude sickness into a genuine emergency, because the nearest real help might be a flight that the weather won't permit. None of this was built overnight, and it grew, in large part, out of the bodies. Disasters like the Wilcox tragedy forced hard questions about how an unregulated stampede up a subarctic giant should be managed. And over the following decades, the Park Service assembled the system that exists today, requiring climbers to register well in advance, screening expeditions, running the ranger patrols, staffing the 14,000-foot camp, and charging a special mountaineering fee that helps pay for the rescues everyone hopes they'll never need. It made Denali safer. Climbers today are better informed, better equipped, and better supported than any generation before them. But look closely at what all that machinery actually changed. It improved the response, it sharpened the warnings, it put trained people and a capable helicopter within reach of the route. What it could not do, what nothing can do, is repeal the physics. It cannot raise the barometric pressure over the summit, or stop the Gulf storms, or bridge the crevasses, or hand a grounded helicopter a sky it can fly through. The system got smarter around the trap. The trap stayed exactly the same. So step back and look at the whole machine, because now you can see all of it working together. And it's more disturbing than any single disaster. The geography sets the trap. 63 degrees north puts the summit under a thin polar sky, so the mountain is physiologically taller than its own height, and it plants the peak directly in the path of the storms that come howling off the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. The terrain compounds it, 18,000 feet of relief laced with hidden crevasses, and a single accessible route that funnels the most people onto the slopes, where small mistakes become fatal falls. Human ambition supplies the exposure because Denali is beautiful and reachable and stands as the giant you climb before the Himalaya. So year after year, 11 or 1,200 people come, most of them onto that one route, many of them underestimating a mountain that looks lower than it lives. Technology changes the shape of the risk without removing it. The bush plane drops you from spruce forest to glacier in 45 minutes, faster than your body should adjust. Forecasts warn you a storm is coming but can't carry you off the mountain before it arrives. A world-class helicopter rescue exists, but is grounded by the very weather that summons it. And distance closes the loop, because when the options run out up high, the help that theoretically exists is separated from you by a wall of wind no aircraft can cross. History is the proof that this is a system, not a run of bad luck. In 1967, a strong team in the best season was destroyed by a storm it could not descend through. In 1984, the greatest solo adventurer of his era summited in winter and vanished on the way down, alone, beyond any rescue. In 1992, one of the finest alpinists alive died in an instant on a hidden crevasse during a routine descent. Different eras, different climbers, different specific causes, and underneath all of them the same trap, closing the same way. The mountain didn't need to change its methods. It didn't need to. The people kept coming, and it kept working. None of this has stopped, because none of the reasons have changed. Every spring, the air taxis in Talkeetna load up again. Climbers step off the plains onto the Kahiltna at 7,200 feet, rope up, and start dragging their sleds toward a summit that will feel 3,000 feet higher than the map admits. The Rangers open the camp at 14,200. The Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska start building the next storm. And somewhere in the coming season, a signal will go out from high on the mountain, and everything modern and capable and well-intentioned will be standing ready at the bottom, waiting for a break in the sky. Picture the end of it then, not as a catastrophe, but as an ordinary afternoon. A rescue helicopter sits on the glacier at 7,200 feet, rotors turning slowly, fueled and crewed and ready to go. Above it, the west buttress disappears into a gray wall of moving cloud, and somewhere inside that wall the wind is running well past 100 miles an hour. A radio signal is coming down from up there, faint and clear at the same time, and everyone on the ground knows exactly what it means and exactly where it's coming from. The blades keep turning. The wall does not open. The mountain that looks like a beginner's Everest, the lower one, the one people can't find on a map, holds what it has taken and waits for the next person to underestimate it.